My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of humans during the fascinating times when the desire of ages, Jesus the Messiah, came to this earth. And they're collected in this book, Victory of the Warrior King, the story of the life of Jesus. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words parental guidance recommended. Mark, Temple in Jerusalem. My name is Mark. Of course, the Most High has his own name for me. I received the name Mark from a human named Juanita. You may call me Mark. For a creature with only 2 vocal cords such as yourself, it is easier to pronounce. The Most High has asked me to share some of my recordings with you from the most fascinating event since the creation of this planet. Every angel not specifically assigned other duties hovers close, eager to see every detail and how humans will respond to it. We know the basics of the plan, and the Most High has revealed them to human prophets, yet we see no indications that Earth is preparing for this event. What are they thinking? I've never been able to read the human mind, but I've recorded enough of them that I have a good idea what they're going to do next. The following are my records of humans during these fascinating times. Levi, on the way to Jerusalem. Are we almost there yet? Levi asked for the umpteenth time. No, son, his father answered. We still have quite a ways yet, don't you remember? Because of the babies, it's been a long time since I've gotten to come with you to Jerusalem. His father nodded. Yes, it was difficult for your mother to travel the past 3 years, but you have 3 fine healthy sisters, so it was worth missing a few of the festivals, wasn't it? Levi wrinkled his nose. You never miss any of the festivals, he protested. Well, of course I can't miss the festivals. I'm a Levite. Levites attend all the festivals in Jerusalem. We have to help with the work. So let me guess which festival it is this time, Levi said, bounding on to another subject. Is this the Feast of Weeks? No, it's not. Don't tell me, his son interrupted. The Festival of Lights? No, you see, Purim. I love Purim. No, his father sighed. It's not Purim. Passover? The father shook his head. But it can't be atonement because we haven't had the Feast of Trumpets yet. Is it trumpets? No. I'm running out of feasts, the boy complained. His father laughed. Levi, we go to Jerusalem for other things too. Once a year I have to do the actual work in the temple. Inside the temple? His son asked in wonder. You mean farther in than the court of women where I've been? Yes, his father replied proudly. The Levites are divided into 24 clans. We each serve 1 week at a time in the temple. What will you do in the temple? Once I get there, we draw lots to determine our assignments. I might serve as a guard, doorkeeper, musician, or as a temple servant in some other capacity. Can you go anywhere? Can you go into the most holy place and see where God lives? No. If any of us Levites went in there, we would die. We aren't even allowed to approach the altar of sacrifice. That is reserved for the priests. There are 24 clans of them, too, and they each take a week and serve in the temple, too. But they light the altar fires, take care of the offerings of incense and unleavened bread, and kill the sacrificial animals. Oh, how come you're not a priest? You're from Levi's family, just like the priests are. Yes, but Levi had a big family. The clans of priests are descendants of Aaron. We are descendants of Moses. The boy thought a moment. Since Moses was more important than Aaron, then we should be more important than the priest, right? Father laughed. It doesn't work quite that way, Levi. But everyone is important in God's eyes. Even me? His father laughed. Yes, even you. I smiled. How young these humans start jostling for rank and trying to determine each other's value in God's eyes. Levi was not the first, and certainly would not be the last, nor the most vocal in this pursuit. I shook my head. Humans remain the same from age to age. Thankfully, the Almighty alters even less. If these humans just understood how much He loves them, and how that never changes no matter what happens, it would give them great security. Levi slowed his pace, lagging behind the men until his mother and her friends caught up with them. They always traveled to Jerusalem in groups. It was safer that way. The terrain was rugged, and they needed to camp overnight on the way, and bandits, to say nothing of Roman soldiers, lurked along the roads. The boy spat in the dirt as he thought about them. Everyone hated the Romans. They were always bossing people around, and horrible things happened to anyone who didn't obey them. Levi noticed his mother sitting on some boulders beside the path with her friend Elizabeth. He headed toward them. "I am so tired," Elizabeth said, pulling off her sandal and rubbing one of her dusty feet. "Every year it gets harder and harder to haul these old bones all the way to Jerusalem. The festivals are wonderful once I get there. I'm always so glad I came, but getting there... Oh," she groaned. Levi's mother nodded. "I know what you mean. I haven't been for 3 years because the babies were little, but I've really missed it." Elizabeth looked longingly at the 2 toddlers and the infant in the woman's arms. "Yes, but children are such a blessing of the Lord. I wouldn't mind missing the festivals if it meant having a child." Staring at the ground, Levi's mother said nothing. The boy glanced at Elizabeth in confusion. Maybe the woman had meant a grandchild. Elizabeth was way too old to be a mother. Anyone could tell by looking that she was a grandmother-type person. His confusion was understandable, for both Elizabeth and her husband were elderly, and most people were grandparents by their age. Yet the Almighty had not blessed them with any children. It was a great sadness to her and her husband Zechariah, for everyone viewed the lack of children as a punishment from God. Later that night as they were camping, Levi heard his mother and father whispering in the darkness. "Poor Elizabeth. She was looking so longingly at the babies. It made me want to just give her one, except I wouldn't ever be able to give up any of these." Levi heard the low mumble of his father's voice, and then Mama said, "It's so hard to understand. After all, Elizabeth is also of the direct line of Aaron. She and Zechariah are godly people, and with such pure lineage, it's hard to understand why the Lord is punishing them in this way." Now father's voice was a little louder. Levi raised up on one elbow so he could hear better. "The Lord isn't punishing Zechariah. A good man. He was like a father to me when my own father died so young. He helped my mother. Widows have a hard time, and he taught me the things that my father would have if he had been alive. God can't be punishing Zechariah. It must be Elizabeth, but the old man does love her. Most men would have taken a second wife or a concubine by now to have children, but yet he's clung to his one wife all these years, even though she has no children." Mother sighed. "Well, God may have deprived her of children, but every woman dreams of a man who would love her that much." "I guess so," her husband said, "especially when he could have taken another or legally divorced her. She must feel truly cherished." Levi nodded in the darkness. That was one thing that was obvious to everyone. "I hope," he mumbled to himself, "when I am a really old man like Zechariah, that I will have a wife like Elizabeth, and we will love each other just as much." Then the boy laid his head in the crook of his arm and fell asleep. As the pilgrims reached the crest of the hill, Levi caught his breath in wonder. Squinting, he raised his hand to shield his eyes. Zechariah laughed. "Yes, young one, that is the impression everyone has when they see the temple for the first time, or after a long absence. Isn't it magnificent?" The brightness hurts my eyes, Levi said. Zechariah nodded his gray head. Yes, mine too, he said. But I just can't tear my eyes away from it. It glows with God's glory. It glows with the glory of Herod's white stone, Mother muttered under her breath, as Zechariah looked over his shoulder at her but said nothing. All of a sudden, the journey did not seem so long. Everyone's steps quickened as they hurried toward the beautiful temple. What's that? Levi asked, pointing to a huge stone fortress. It's right up against the temple. What is it? That, said Father, is the Antonia fortress. The Romans watch everything from it. How dare they build it right next to the temple so that they can peer down into the very courtyards of it? The boy exclaimed. His father nodded and said nothing. As we near the city now, Zechariah said, we must make no more comments about the Romans. The boy nodded. He knew it didn't take much to antagonize the Romans, and they could be cruel. Just pray for the arrival of the Messiah, Zechariah said. Levi understood what he meant. When the Messiah came, the Romans would no longer rule. He whispered a prayer as they walked along. I watched him intently. For 11 years old, he was devout. But his expectations of the coming Messiah, though shared by most in Israel, only set him up for disappointment. I wondered how and when we would be allowed to reveal to him the Messiah's real role. For now, though, I would have to watch and wait, just like Levi and his family and Zechariah and Elizabeth. The little group of pilgrims soon found their quarters within the city. The women began to settle their few belongings and get ready for an evening meal. Father and Zechariah, with the other men in the group, rounded up their livestock. Come here, baby, Levi called to the best lamb from their flock, scooping it up in his arms. He had brought her to offer her as a sacrifice to God. It's almost time for you to go to the temple. Holding her close, he scratched her woolly head. It was hard to think about her being burned on the altar, yet Zechariah had explained to him how God is a God of mercy, and how the priests had been taught just the proper way to slit the throat of the animals so that they felt no pain. He hugged the animal so tightly that she grunted. You won't feel a thing, he said. I promise. Zechariah promised. It's such an honor, you know, being the most perfect lamb in the whole flock. You're the only one good enough to offer to Yahweh. The lamb bleated as if it understood. Soon the men were ready. It's time, Levi said, and he and the lamb followed them toward the temple. The closer they got, the more enormous and impressive it seemed. They passed through the gates into the crowded courtyard. Vendors sold sacrificial lambs for those who had not brought one, or whose lambs were not perfect. Only perfect lambs could be sacrificed to God. Money changers sat at their tables, for everyone had to exchange their money for temple currency. Levi studied the fascinating people, Persians and Babylonians and Greeks, who had all come to the temple. Over here, Levi, Father called. A priest stood near the lamb vendors. Bring your lamb over here. We have to have it inspected. Levi nodded and presented the lamb proudly. The priest handled her roughly, picking her up, looking at her belly and her legs, then squeezing her back leg hard. The animal bleated in surprise and pain. He's hurting her, the boy hissed. I'm afraid this lamb is lame, the priest announced. Only perfect lambs are acceptable for sacrifice. You can't use this one. It's the best of our flock, Father protested. It is perfect. The priest dropped the animal onto the cobblestones. It limped over to Levi and tried to hide behind his legs. It looks like it limps to me, the priest insisted. The animal may be good enough for whatever village you people come from, but it's not good enough for the temple or God. If I were you, I would see what I could get for her at the stall over there and buy one of their lambs. They have good lambs. Father's fists were clenched at his side, and Zechariah's eyes blazed with fury. Levi's throat choked. He didn't want to sacrifice the lamb, but how dare anybody say she wasn't perfect? It wasn't that way before that priest hurt her leg, he muttered. Father nodded and made a slight gesture with his hand that Levi knew meant, don't say anything else right now. The boy fell silent. The sheep vendor said the same thing as the priest and tossed a small coin to Father. This is all I can give you for a lame one, he said. Now how's about buying one of our good lambs? How much? Father asked resignedly. And as the merchant quoted a price, Father's fist clenched again. That's 3 times what a lamb is even worth, and more than 3 times what you gave me for this one. Oh, well, it's like the priest said, the vendor replied with a shrug. Father's jaw clenched tightly. He flung the coins down on the table and roughly grabbed the perfect lamb. I watched carefully as the 3 prepared to go to the temple. They had risen before dawn, eaten a quick breakfast, and bathed and dressed with care. Zechariah to draw lots and find what his tasks would be for the day within the temple. Levi's father to find out what his responsibilities would be around the temple grounds, and Levi to watch and absorb it all. Do you think I'll be able to see you where you're working, Father? He asked. I don't know, Levi. It depends what they assign me, but if you stand close to the doorway, you should be able to see. I can't wait till next year when I become a son of the law and can enter the courtyard, Levi said wistfully. Being 11, he could only approach as close as the court of women. Well, it could be worse, Father said. You could be a Gentile. Then you wouldn't even be allowed in the court of women. The boy remembered seeing the signs warning that any Gentiles who passed from the outer court into the court of women would pay with their lives. Yes, he said. I'm very thankful I'm not a Gentile, but I'm glad I'm not a woman, too, because at least I'll be a man someday. Father and Zechariah laughed. Mother and Elizabeth just glanced at each other and said nothing. Approaching the temple at sunrise struck awe and reverence into their hearts, just as it had the day before. Father and Levi placed themselves on either side of the elderly priest and helped Zechariah up the long stairway. Why do they put in so many steps? Levi puffed. Zechariah was too short of breath to answer, but Father replied, It's to give us reverence, to remind everyone that the Lord is high and lifted up, and so that people outside can't see into the temple. When God gave Moses the plans for the tabernacle in the wilderness, did he have stairs in it? Levi asked. Zechariah shook his head, breathing heavily, and the boy began thinking to himself. It made me think, too. The Creator I knew had designed the wilderness tabernacle with the specific purpose of being with his people, not distancing himself from them. The steps were a human idea, designed to create awe and distance between the Almighty and those he was trying so hard to be with. As they paused at the top of the steps before entering the court of women, the father turned to his son. You would have liked Moses' tabernacle, Levi, he said. I believe families came there. Fathers would bring the sin offering. One could pass through its gates with singing and stand before the altar of sacrifice and watch their sin offering being prepared. There was no court of women, so you would have been allowed to see what was going on. Levi caught his breath wistfully. Oh, I wish I had lived back then, he murmured. Why do we have it like this now? Is this what God wants? Zechariah gave him a sharp look. Levi, hissed his father, never question the temple. But isn't the temple just a place? And isn't it God's place? Shouldn't we do things the way he wanted it? Father shot him another warning glance, and Levi fell silent, but he still wondered. I smiled to myself. This child may not be old enough to become a son of the law until next year, but he thinks. A trait the Almighty takes great delight in. Levi stood as close to the opening between the court of women and the outer court of the temple as possible. He watched the priests and the Levites divide into 2 groups. The priests stood in a semicircle. One of them seemed to be the leader or the chief, and he was talking. Levi wished he could hear what he was saying. Then all the priests held up their fingers. Some held up just one, some more. The chief priest began counting off until he reached some number he must have decided in his head earlier. The priest he stopped at seemed very excited and stepped back from the group. The chief priest began to count again, and soon he paused at another, who also bowed and stepped back from the group. After a few moments, he had selected 4 priests. The rest of the priests dispersed to other duties. Zechariah walked back toward Levi. "They didn't pick you for anything?" the boy asked. "Not this time." Zechariah took a deep breath and smiled. "They'll cast lots again for the evening prayers, and there's always tomorrow. I'm serving here all week." The old priest would have more chances, Levi told himself. "What kind of jobs were the priests who were chosen going to do?" he questioned. Said Zechariah, "the first one received the task of cleansing the altar of burnt offering and then preparing the sacrifice." "That sounds like hard work." "Yes," said Zechariah, "but what an honor to do that for the Lord." That it would be, the boy decided. He would never be able to do that, being just a Levite. "What is the second priest going to do?" he continued after some thought. "The second priest actually offers the sacrifice, and he will also cleanse the candlestick and the altar of incense." Levi drew in his breath. How wonderful! That meant the priest would be able to enter the holy place, for that was where the candlestick and the altar of incense stood, right before the curtain that separated it from the most holy place. It was as close to God as any Israelite could ever go, except for the high priest on the Day of Atonement. "And the third priest?" "The third priest will offer incense this morning," Zechariah explained. "It's the most important job for any priest this week." Levi smiled. So close to the most holy place, and not cleaning either, but offering incense, making a wonderful fragrance before the Lord while presenting prayers for the Messiah to come. Then he would watch the smoke from the incense gently wafting up from the altar and slipping over the curtain into God's very presence. "So the 4th priest must have felt a little disappointed by the time he was chosen," Levi observed. Zechariah shook his head. "All of us are honored to serve God wherever we are asked. I suppose some would consider it is less of an honor to be the 4th one chosen, though he will burn the pieces of the sacrifice on the altar and perform the concluding part of the service. But anything done for God, whether it is in his temple, before the curtain at the altar of incense, or whether it is chores done at home as a service unto the Lord, is just as important in the eyes of the Almighty." I nodded until I realized neither of them could see me and weren't even aware I was there. Yet I too smiled. The old man was wise and understood many things, and I was glad he was sharing his wisdom with young Levi. The afternoon seemed to speed by to Levi. Zechariah sat with him as they watched the activities in the temple. The elderly priest explained each sacrifice as it took place while they peered in through the open gate. It seemed like no time at all until the priests began to assemble in the courtyard again. "I need to join them," Zechariah told the boy. "Why? What are they doing?" "They will be casting lots for the evening burning of the incense." "But what about those priests over there?" Levi pointed. "Oh, one can have this honor only once in their life. Those are priests who have already burned incense before the Lord. It was the greatest moment of their life. Never again will they experience anything as wonderful as that. I have never done it. Now I need to go." Levi nodded. He stood on his tiptoes, watching with anticipation as the casting of lots took place. Suddenly he shrieked with delight, causing a murmur to ripple through the crowds and people to turn and stare at him. But he couldn't help it. They had selected Zechariah. The old priest turned and faced the entrance of the temple. He seemed to stand taller, his shoulders less bent, his step firmer. Zechariah gestured to 2 priests next to him who flanked him on either side as they walked to the entrance and stepped into the holy place. Levi knew what would come next. Zechariah had explained it all to him. One of the two priests with him would remove the old coals from the altar. The second would lay new coals on it. Then they would respectfully back out of the holy place, leaving the chosen priest before the Lord. The third priest would lay the incense on the altar and pray fervently for the coming of the Messiah, as the beautiful cloud of smoke arose from the incense and filled the holy place, and passed over the veil into the most holy place. His prayers would go right to the mercy seat, the throne of God. Surely God would listen when Zechariah pleaded for the Messiah to come. The crowd waited. It didn't take long for the prayer, and no one was dismissed from the evening worship until the priest offering the incense returned to the entrance of the temple, raised both hands, and blessed them. What was taking Zechariah so long? Levi thought to himself. Of course, sometimes old men were a little bit slower. The crowd continued to wait in silence. After what seemed like forever, murmuring broke out.
What's happened? Has the old man become ill in there? He was too old to be given such an important duty.
No, there was nothing physically wrong with him. He's just old. We should respect him, let him take his time. Perhaps he's praying longer for the Messiah. The Almighty knows we need him now. Levi tried to shut out the noise of the crowd about him. He remembered the conversation he and Zechariah had had that afternoon.
This would be the perfect time for the Messiah to come,
the priest had told him.
Although we hate the Romans with every fiber of our being, they do give us some advantages. We are at the crossroads of the known world right now. Everyone understands common languages all around the world. The Romans have built roads everywhere, and it is easier than it has ever been since the dawn of time for people and messages to travel. If the Messiah were to come now, word could spread everywhere more quickly than we had ever dreamed possible. And surely there's been no time when we have needed him more than now.
A murmur rippled through the crowd again, startling Levi out of his thoughts. Zechariah had appeared in the doorway.
Thank you, God,
Levi whispered. It had been so long. What had Zechariah been doing in there? As Levi struggled to get a better look, he was startled by Zechariah's face. It glowed with such a brightness. The crowd caught its collective breath.
It's like Moses. He has the radiance of Moses.
The whispers spread like wildfire. When Moses had spoken with God on the mountain, his face had glowed like this. The crowd waited expectantly for Zechariah to raise his hands in benediction and dismiss them. Instead, he seemed to be trying to speak and gesturing with just one hand. "We can't hear you! Speak up!" someone shouted. A pain, almost physical, stabbed through Levi as he realized Zechariah was gesturing with his hand because he didn't seem able to speak. He was trying, but he couldn't. Was he able to lift his other hand? Why couldn't he talk? His two priest friends who had assisted him at the altar of incense rushed to his side. Everyone began trying to understand what he was attempting to communicate. "What happened?" they asked. "Are you ill?" Zechariah continued to gesture wildly. "Did you see something?"
"Did the Lord speak to you?" "Surely not a demon in the holy place."
"Was it an angel?" The more questions they asked, the more frenzied Zechariah's gestures became. Gently they led him off to the side. Another priest blessed the people and dismissed them. Levi could hardly stand it. He wanted to rush into the courtyard up to the entrance of the temple and help the old man, but he could not go past the portal of the court of women. The priests summoned Levi's father, who led Zechariah gently toward the exit. Another priest sent a servant to bring a donkey to the outer courts. Gently they helped Zechariah onto the donkey, and supporting him on both sides, led him home. I glided along with them, as shocked as they were, but for different reasons, for I had seen what had happened in the holy place, and I was astounded. Zechariah had been praying for the coming of the Messiah, and Gabriel, our captain, the highest-ranking angel in heaven, had appeared before him at the altar and told him that his prayers were being answered, and that the Messiah was coming soon. Even more than that, he notified Zechariah that he and Elizabeth would have a son who would prepare the way for the Messiah. That had not surprised me, for all of us knew it was almost time and were watching intently to see what would happen. What was shocking was his disbelief. This human had spent his entire life praying fervently for one thing, and when told his prayers were answered, he responded not with joy and shouts of celebration and praise, but with disbelief. Humans were impossible to understand. Yet the Almighty and the Creator had such a passionate love for them. I shrugged, grateful that my duties did not include understanding humans, merely recording their activities and responses. Had I been required to understand them too, I surely would have been judged incompetent. At home, Levi and his father lifted Zechariah from the donkey and supported him into the house they were staying at for the week. Mother and Elizabeth anxiously rushed to the door. "What happened?" Mother demanded. "Is he okay?" Zechariah pulled his arms free and flung them around Elizabeth. The two stood there holding each other tightly, rocking back and forth. Tears poured down both of their faces. Elizabeth buried her face in Zechariah's beard. His face still glowed, like in the stories of Moses when he had been speaking to God. "Something happened at the temple," Father said at last. "Zechariah was chosen to burn incense for the evening prayers. He did not come out for a long time. We were very worried about him. When he did return, he glowed like this." He pointed toward the elderly man. "But he seemed unable to speak. Some of us believe he must have heard from God, or at least spoken with an angel. Yet why would he have been stricken speechless? In the outer courts was a servant who had studied under a Greek physician. He said this problem was common with people who had had an injury to their head, that often they would be weak on one side and unable to speak for a time. Sometimes they recover, sometimes they die." Elizabeth drew herself to her full height, and her eyes blazed as she snapped, "There is nothing wrong with my husband's head. He has obviously heard from the Lord. Look at his face. How can you deny it? There will always be people who try to explain the Lord's actions with natural explanations as an excuse not to have to believe." Suddenly she turned pale, took 2 steps backward, turned on her heel, and walked quickly from the room toward the water jar in the courtyard. She sank to the ground next to it as she took several long, slow sips from a cup. Mother frowned. Levi was confused. Did Elizabeth know something that the rest of them had missed? Sometimes old couples seemed to know each other so well they could finish each other's sentences. Perhaps Elizabeth knows what happened, Levi thought. I sure wish I did. I hope Zechariah's going to be all right. And what is wrong with Elizabeth? He wandered back toward the stables. "I will take the donkey back," he offered as his father laid his hand on his shoulder. "Good, I'll go with you." They walked along in silence. "Do you have any idea what happened in there?" the boy asked. His father shook his head. "No, son, but Zechariah was in there praying for the coming of the Messiah, and from the glow on his face, my feeling is that something wonderful is going to happen. Let's both continue to pray for that." Levi nodded. "Oh yes, I certainly will." Father and son both prayed silently as they walked along together with the oblivious donkey. A peace settled over the two. Levi drew a deep breath and let it out. Whatever had happened to Zechariah, Yahweh, the King of the universe, was in control. He had heard Zechariah's prayers, and everything was going to be all right, no matter how he chose to answer. This broadcast has come from the book Victory of the Warrior King by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.